Well, today we're going to be talking about markets again, but in this case, we're going to be talking about a very specific market, one that's going to have a very direct impact on your life in the near future. Today, we're going to be dealing with labor markets. Labor markets have a lot of similarities to all of the markets that we've already examined. There's demand, there's supply, there's a price, there's equilibrium, there are shifts in the demand and supply curves. What's different about the labor market relative to other markets, though, is that now the roles of the players in the market are essentially reversed. Instead of you being a buyer and some business being the seller, you are now the seller, basically of yourself in the market. You're selling yourself as a resource or as an input to the firm who's doing the buying. So that's the real change that we see in the market. Now, of course, because these markets have a very direct and important impact on individuals, labor markets have a lot of contention. There's always the cry on the part of the worker that we're not getting paid enough. There's always the position that of the business that you're such a huge expense for us that maybe we can't compete because you're asking for too much money. So there's always been, and this is not a recent development. There have always been conflicts between employers and employees. What we want to do is not focus so much on the conflict side of things, but on the why and the what. What's going on in the labor market? Why is it happening? So that we can understand that market better and hopefully help you to be in a better position when you are in the labor market after you graduate to be able to put yourself in a better position to earn a higher income. So let's start taking a look at the labor market. As I mentioned, firms are now on the demand side of the market. But this demand is kind of unique. It's a little bit different than the demand that we have for the products that firms produce. When we're talking about demand for a specific input or a specific resource like labor, firms don't demand that simply because they like people, simply because you have a winning personality. That's not why firms want to hire you. They want to hire you and any worker and really any other input because there's a demand for the product that the firm is producing. Think about it this way. Ford hires workers not because they love workers, but because they need those workers to produce cars because the consumers are demanding cars. Without the demand for cars, there's no demand for the worker. This is something that we call derived demand. Derived demand is simply demand that comes from the demand for something else. So as I was talking about with cars, so here's a car, and some consumer down here wants that car. But to build the car, Ford needs workers. They need lots of workers. And so Ford has a demand for these workers in order to build the cars that you are demanding. So if you remember, back very early in the semester, we had this circular flow model. Here were the households, here were the firms. Up here we had the product market. And down here we had the resource market. Well, you want the car from the product market. Here it is again. Very bad looking car, but that's the car. In order to make that product, the firm needs workers. So here is the demand for resources, the demand for all these workers, that's coming from the firm. So in the product market, the households are the demand, and in the resource market, the firms are the demand. So these are two parts of this circular flow. And again, derived demand means that the demand for labor is derived, or it comes from the demand for the final good or service. Because there's a demand for cars, there's a demand for labor. Because there's a demand for iPhones, there's a demand for labor. Because there's a demand for education, there's a demand for labor. People to teach things. That's what we mean by derived demand. Okay, now what we want to take a look at, understanding that demand, is why do some people get paid more than others? Well, let's start off with this particular question. Why isn't this job, the job of hamburger flipper, why isn't that worth $15 an hour? There are a lot of people who say that we need a higher wage. Workers need to be paid more so that they can have be paid a livable wage. Now that's a normative statement. That's a position that someone might take if they have a strong feeling towards this issue. It's a value judgment. But from a dollars and cents perspective, this job isn't worth $15 an hour. It may be harsh to say that, but one of the reasons why it's not worth $15 an hour has to do with thinking at the margin. And we've talked about thinking at the margin a lot, so let's examine this a little bit more carefully. The first reason why some people get paid more than others is that sometimes people add more to profit than other workers. If you add more to the profitability of the firm, then you have every right and reason to expect that you're going to get paid more. Let's take a look at it from this perspective. Remember, we talked a little bit about the difference between fixed inputs and variable inputs. This was a few weeks ago. So the variable inputs are basically your workers. Your fixed inputs are your capital. So you have a factory over here or some type of machine over here. I'll try to draw a bulldozer. There we go. So you have your fixed inputs on one side and your variable inputs on the other. Our focus is going to be entirely here on the variable inputs. One of the problems that we saw with variable and fixed inputs and the way we combined them was that as the number of workers goes up, in other words, as labor increases, then output went up, but it did so at a diminishing rate. So it increased, but it didn't increase at the same rate when you added the fifth and the sixth and the seventh workers. We called this diminishing marginal productivity. Diminishing marginal productivity. So the additional worker, given a fixed amount of capital, would add to output, but only at smaller and smaller and smaller amounts. And then at some point, those added workers actually added negatively to output, and we didn't want to hire them. So with that idea of diminishing marginal product, we can start to understand this first reason for why some workers are paid more than others. To do this, we need to add a new idea. We know that the marginal product of labor is the increase in the output of a worker, of a new worker. So when there's a new worker added to the labor force, or to the firm, the marginal product is the increase in output. What we want to look at now is a concept known as the value of the marginal product. So not just what are you adding to output, but what are you adding to revenues? The value of the marginal product is what each worker adds to the revenues of the firm. basically, what we're looking at here is the benefit from adding another worker. What's the marginal benefit to the firm? We compute the value of the marginal product. So we're going to call that VMP with a little subscript L for labor. The value of the marginal product is equal to the marginal product of labor, the increase in the output that each new worker contributes, and we're going to multiply that by the price of the product. So how much output do you contribute? What is the added output from a new worker? The added output from a new worker, and we're going to multiply that by the price of the good being produced. So how much can we sell this for? That's what that price is. So that's what we're looking for, the value of the marginal product. Since the value of the marginal product is the added benefit from hiring another worker, to think about this at the margin, we need to compare it to the added cost. So we're going to compare the value of the marginal product to the new cost from hiring this worker. So think about it. What is the cost to the business of hiring another worker? If you said the wages they have to pay that worker, or whatever compensation, have a biscuit. You got the answer right. The added cost, the new cost, the marginal cost, if you will, of hiring another worker is the wage. So what we're going to do is compare the wage to the value of the marginal product. That's just marginal thinking in the labor market. We're comparing the added cost to the added benefit from hiring a new worker. Okay, so let's put some data into a table here so that we can see where that hiring process would take place. So we'll have a couple of columns here. We'll first of all start off with the number of workers. We'll just call that labor. And then we're going to have the output from the worker. We'll put a column here for the marginal product of labor. And then we will put in the value of the marginal product of labor. We will add a column for the wage. And then finally, we'll have a column for what we're going to call the marginal profit. The marginal profit, which will be the value of the marginal product minus the wage. This last column is where we're going to see the comparison between the marginal cost, or the wage, and the marginal benefit, or the value of the marginal product. So we'll start off with some workers here. 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay. So those are our workers, and the output is going to be, well, with no workers, we have no output. And then we will increase to 50 units of output. We'll go to 90, then 120, 140, 150, and then 140. So there are our numbers for labor and output. The marginal product is the change in output as we change the number of workers. Now our change in number of workers is always 1. So that's our delta L. Marginal product, remember, is change in output over change in the number of workers. I'm just going to say that L. And that's always going to be 1. In our case, we just keep adding one more worker. So right here, there's no change because there's nothing to change from. We haven't started to produce yet. When we add our first worker, the change in output is from 0 to 50. So the change in output is 50 divided by 1, which makes our marginal product 50. When we go to our second worker, again, we're going to divide, our change in labor is going to be 1. So we'll divide the change in output by 1. Change in output is from 50 to 90. We've added 40 units of output. We're going to divide that by 1 worker, so our marginal product is 40. And then our output goes up by 30, then by 20, then by 10. And then when we add the 6th worker, look what happens. We have a negative number. Our output falls. So we can see diminishing marginal product of labor because the marginal product goes down as we hire the 2nd worker and the 3rd worker and the 4th worker and the 5th worker. Those numbers are getting smaller. So there is diminishing marginal product of labor. When we get to the 6th worker, we have negative marginal product. So we can almost already say we're not going to hire that 6th worker. That would be crazy. But just to make sure, we want to compare the added benefit with the marginal value of the marginal product to the marginal cost. So here again this is the marginal benefit to the firm. And we figure that out by taking the marginal product of labor times the price of the good that they're selling. So we're going to set the price equal to 10. So let's do that here. We'll say price is equal to 10 for the product. And now we just multiply marginal product of labor times the price. Again, this is going to be 0 because we have no output, so it doesn't matter what the price is. And then we're going to take the marginal product of 50 times the price of 10, which will give us 500 here. 40 times 10 is going to give us 400, then 300, 200, 100, and then minus 100. So right now the value of this 6th worker is clearly negative. All right, let's see what happens with the wage. Now we'll have a constant wage. We'll pay all workers the same. We're a very fair business here. We're going to set the wage equal to 100 in this example. So each worker gets paid 100. So we have no workers. We don't have to worry about that here. But every other place down the line, we see that the worker earns $100. So the new worker earns $100, and the new worker earns $100. And then the 4th worker, they would earn $100 all the way down. So the wage is always the same. It's always 100 because here we're looking at the wage for the new worker. Because this, again, is the marginal cost. So we're looking at what's the added cost? Well, our 1st worker is 100. The added cost for adding the 2nd worker, well, that's another 100. So now we can figure out the marginal profit. The marginal profit is the value of the marginal product, which are the numbers in green, minus the wage, which are the numbers in black. So the value of the marginal product, again, nothing here. But when we hire the 1st worker, we take 500 minus 100 to give us a value of the worker, or the marginal profit from adding that 1st worker, of 400. The 2nd worker, the value of their marginal product is 400. Their wage is 100, so we just subtract 100 from 400 and get 300. The 3rd worker has a marginal profit of 200. The 4th worker has a marginal profit of 100. Then we get to the 5th worker. The 5th worker has a marginal profit of 0. Then the 6th worker has a marginal profit of minus 200. Because we start off with a minus 100 and then we subtract another 100. So that gives us a value of their marginal product minus the wage of a pretty significant negative number here. So, who are we going to hire? Well, we can very clearly see that this 6th worker, we're not hiring them. Because the value of their marginal product is negative and their marginal profit is even a bigger negative, we don't hire them. We can make a very strong case for hiring the 1st worker, the 2nd worker, the 3rd worker, and the 4th worker. because the value of their marginal product is high enough to cover their wage. We have 400, 300, 200, 100. Those are all positive numbers that are adding to profit. The fifth worker is a little bit trickier, though. We can give the fifth worker a resounding maybe. They're not costing us anything in terms of profit, but they're not making us profit either. That being said, it might be wise to hire this worker. What if one of your other workers leaves? Then you can move worker number 5 up the food chain. Maybe worker number 5 is going to be incredibly productive and may find a better way of producing things. Because they don't add or subtract to profit, because their marginal profit is 0, it's pretty likely that this person will be hired, but there's no guarantee of it. When the firm is looking to hire someone, they want to hire someone up to, or they can justify hiring someone up to the point where the value of their marginal product is equal to their wage. Another way of saying this would be to say you would hire someone as up to the point where the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, which, if you recall, is something that's really similar to the profit maximizing condition. We said that the profit maximizing condition was where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Well, that's essentially the equivalent of saying that the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. So that's really our first reason why someone gets hired and why somebody gets paid more. You can see that if someone adds a lot more in terms of the value of their marginal product, the firm can justify hiring that person and paying them more. If, for example, you work at a law firm and the partners of the law firm are bringing in a lot more in terms of revenue, if the value of their marginal product is higher than, say the janitor, it's not that the janitor doesn't do essential work, it's that the janitor isn't bringing in the big bucks. And if you bring in more in terms of the value of your marginal product, you can ask for more in income, and you should be paid more because you're contributing more to the profits of the firm. So that's the first reason why someone gets paid more. The value of their marginal product is higher. The second reason somebody gets paid more involves a difference in what they're actually producing relative to somebody else. So we're not talking about somebody in the same company. We're talking about people in different companies. Why do some people in some companies get paid more than people in other companies? Why do people who are blacksmiths get paid so much less than someone who is an information security specialist? Well, the answer to that is because of what those people produce. Blacksmiths work really hard. The job is really tough. So here's a blacksmith putting a shoe on a horse. That's actually a really dangerous thing to do. Blacksmiths used to be instrumental. You had to have a blacksmith in your community. In fact, blacksmiths, if they wanted to sail over to the New World from Europe, blacksmiths could demand a fee to go on the ship because they were so important. Now, even though the work hasn't changed very much, it's still hard and it's still dangerous, blacksmiths don't get paid what they used to get paid. In fact, there are a lot fewer blacksmiths now than there used to be. The reason is pretty obvious. Just ask yourself, when was the last time you rode your horse to school? Much of what blacksmiths do simply isn't in demand anymore. And that happens. That happens in a lot of different industries. This is something we refer to as creative destruction. Creative destruction occurs when economies develop. And we really do want creative destruction, although it does cost some people their jobs. There's not as many blacksmiths anymore because we don't need blacksmiths. We drive cars. We don't shoe horses. We don't have a need for ironwork on our buggies because we're not riding in buggies anymore. Blacksmiths simply aren't in demand. Journalists are not in demand in the way they used to be because newspapers aren't as prevalent as they used to be. So many newspapers now don't put out full-time editions. The Post-Gazette in Pittsburgh doesn't put out a full-time edition. The Times-Picayune in New Orleans, I think, is entirely online. So there's just a lot less work for a journalist these days. So many people consume their information from websites that just the old-fashioned kind of journalism isn't performed anymore. Things change. If things didn't change, we'd still be paying blacksmiths and journalists and VCR repairmen. Things change. And if you don't keep up with those changes, then you might find that you're not going to get paid very much. So that's our second reason. The second reason why people get paid more, that some people get paid more than others, is because of what you produce. You need to produce something people want. This seems sort of ridiculous and obvious, but it's sadly not as obvious as you might imagine. To illustrate this, we need to focus our attention on the labor markets, and in particular, what happens when there is a change in demand for the product labor produces. When there's a change in demand for the product that a labor produces. So let's take a look at that. Let's say we're in the market here for, let's say, horseshoes. So in that market, there's a price and a quantity. We have demand and we have supply. If the demand for this product goes down, so there's D2, the price that can be charged for horseshoes is going to go down. And that's going to have an impact on the labor market. So over here, we have our demand for blacksmiths. There's a quantity and there's a price, but we typically refer to the price as the wage. Here's the demand for blacksmiths early on, and here's the supply. So we'll say this is the demand for blacksmiths in, say, 1850. Here's the demand for blacksmiths in 2020. Here's the price in 1850, and here's the price in 2020. You see that the price, the wage that they can command, that blacksmiths can command, will drop. Now, of course, this assumes the supply stays constant. If the supply changes, we've got another story. But our focus here is on demand. As people change the demand for what they want, then the demand for the laborers changes as well. That's the idea of derived demand that we mentioned a few minutes ago. So if you want to make more than somebody else, you need to make sure you're producing things that people want. Let's take a look at this for a newer industry. In this case, we're going to look at this same illustration, but look at it from the perspective of information security. Businesses want information security. They need their information to be secure. And as a result of persistent attacks from threats, whether it's from Russia, whether it's from China, the demand for information security goes up. And as a result of that, we see the price go up. Now here's the issue. You need someone to provide that information security. So over here, we'll put the InfoSec specialist. The people who are actually learning how to provide information security. Here's the demand early on. We'll say in 2010. Here's supply. And here is the wage that InfoSec security specialists can command? Well, as firms change their demand for this product, the demand for InfoSec specialists goes up. And the result is that those people in those industries can ask for more money. The price for these employees goes up. The same thing applies for businesses like nurses. As the population ages, the demand for nursing increases. And when the demand for nurses increase, and the demand for the services that nurses provide increase, the wages that nurses get paid should go up as well. But again, if you're a blacksmith, if you're a journalist, if you're a VCR repair specialist, you may be really good at what you do, but because the demand for what you are producing is going down, the wage that you can expect is going to go down as well. So that's our second reason for why some people get paid more. Some people add more to profit. Other people are producing things that consumers want. At least they're producing things where consumers want a lot more of it. The last reason why some people might get paid more is simply due to their productivity. How effective are they at doing their job? This has nothing to do with profitability per se, but just can you do your job well? Now, that has a kind of a science fiction connection to it, because even if you do your job well, if the job can be mechanized, you might be in serious trouble of losing that job. So this last reason, I want to kind of give the title of Don't Lose Your Job to a Robot. So reason number 3 why some people get paid more than other people focuses on changes in the cost of production. Changes in the cost of production, or don't lose your job to a robot. It's just simply a fact that some jobs are more easily mechanized than other jobs. So the question really here is, can we substitute technology for labor? Can you substitute technology for labor? If the answer is yes, then watch out. Because the demand for labor will go down. Robots don't need retirement plans. Robots don't need time off. Robots don't need medical benefits. If the answer is no, though, you have the opportunity to ask for more money. Essentially, if the answer is yes, there's more competition for your job. If the answer is no, there's less competition for your job. Let's put this in the perspective, or let's put this in the context of the labor market. So again, here's the quantity, and here is the wage. Here's demand for labor, and here's supply. If it is easy to substitute technology for labor, this is what we should expect to see. We should see a decrease in demand if a robot can do your job. So what does that mean? It means that when you are choosing your major, you need to be careful. You need to be considerate. You need to do some research. Is it possible for a robot to do your job? One of the reasons why the economy that we are living in has changed so much in terms of employment is because, and by that I mean shifting from manufacturing to service, is because service jobs are hard for technology to replace. It's hard for a robot to be a financial advisor. It's hard for a robot to be a teacher. It's hard for a robot to be a nurse. It's not hard for a robot to put pieces of metal together. So the jobs in manufacturing, some of them are going overseas, but some of them are simply being replaced by technology because they're easy to replace. So when you choose your major, you need to choose carefully if you're interested in making money. You need to choose majors that are in demand. You need to choose things where you can have a high value of marginal product. And you need to choose majors where it's not easy for technology to replace you. Those are things that really drive the labor market. So whether or not you think a hamburger flipper should be paid $15 an hour is almost beside the point. The way the labor market functions, the way businesses consider who they hire and how much they pay, has a lot more to do with what we feel, but has a lot less to do with what we feel than what actually transpires in the labor market. So just to wrap this section on labor demand up, let's take a look one last time at the labor market and how demand for labor changes. Really what we're looking at here are the demand shifters for labor. The demand shifters for labor. And those things include a change in the demand for what you are producing. Again, are you a nurse or are you a journalist? There's a change in demand for these kinds of jobs. Secondly, what about a change in the cost of production? In other words, what we're talking about here are the relative costs between capital and labor. If the tech costs less, or if tech costs fall, then demand for labor is going to fall as well. And then finally, what about the change in labor productivity? A change in labor productivity. If it increases, that's going to mean demand increases. One of the reasons why students go to college is so that they can reflect or they can send a signal about being more productive. College graduates earn more. Why? Well, they have more information, they have more knowledge, but they've sent a signal of the ability to be more productive. If labor is less productive, if labor decreases in productivity, then the demand for it's going to go down as well. These are demand shifters in the labor market and things that you have to pay attention to. If you're interested in making money, if you're interested in finding a job, these are all really important factors. Just one picture to solidify this in your mind. This was a picture that I took in the Seattle SeaTac airport a number of years ago now, but this was the first time I'd ever seen a self-ordering kiosk in a McDonald's. And what's interesting about this is that SeaTac requires the businesses at the airport to pay $15 an hour. And McDonald's said, you know what? It's not worth it. It's not worth $15 an hour to hire as many people as we have been hiring. So they replaced some of their workforce with self-ordering kiosks because the relative cost between capital, the machines, and labor had changed. Labor was now relatively more expensive, and it just made sense to put machines in place of workers. You may want to pay workers more, but the more you pay workers, the more problematic that can become if there is a viable capital replacement, if there's a machine that can take the job. Just because you put in place a law that says you have to pay workers a certain amount of money doesn't mean that businesses have to continue hiring workers. That's the thing you have to be careful of. That's the thing that economics can teach us. So anyway, those are things that affect the demand side of the model. What about things that affect the supply side? We're the supply. Humans, we are the supply of labor. What are some of the things that affect the supply side of labor? When it comes to the supply of labor, the most common idea that comes up is something we refer to as the labor-leisure trade-off. Because we only have so much time in a day, there is a limit as to how much people can work. The wage in this idea, or under this way of looking at things, is the opportunity cost of not working. So if you decide to take an afternoon off, or if you decide to quit a job, or if you decide not to take an overtime opportunity that a boss is providing, then you are giving up the wage. So the wage is the opportunity cost of not working. Now, if the wage for a job increases, that means that the opportunity cost also goes up. This applies to whether you are working currently. So again, in the case of working more hours or overtime, this would affect what's going on. Or it might also affect whether you try to enter the workforce or not. So if wages are higher, staying out of the workforce entirely now has a higher opportunity cost. And we see this relationship between wages and opportunity cost play out in the supply curve itself, the supply curve of labor. So let's take a look at that. Here's the quantity of labor, and here is the wage. And the supply curve is upward sloping. What that indicates to us is that at low wages, the quantity of labor supplied is low. So we'll just say wage low. That's what the L stands for. But as the wage goes up, then people are now looking at providing more labor because it's worth their time. It's worth giving up some time at home. It's worth giving up vacation time because you're getting paid to compensate you for the leisure you would otherwise have. That's the labor-leisure trade-off. So for this particular market, let's say this is the market for teachers. So we're talking about a labor market for teachers. If teacher wages go up, then there's going to be more of a desire to provide labor in that market. At lower wages, you don't have as many people contributing to that labor force. You have a smaller quantity of labor supplied. Now, at some point, you may say, well, I don't care really how much the wage is. I just can't work anymore. Or I want to take some time off. I want to spend some of the money that I've been making. So there's a theory in labor econ that says that at some point the labor supply curve might look like this, where it's backward bending, so that at some point, even at super high wages, the quantity of labor that you're willing to supply is actually less than it was at a lower wage. Now, that's kind of an interesting question, but this reflects the labor-leisure trade-off. If you are making a lot of money but don't have any time to spend it, what's the point? So humans look at labor and the provision of labor and labor supply not in the way that businesses look at supplying products necessarily. The human element, the idea that you can't work 50 hours a day simply because it's impossible to do so, gives us this kind of potential theoretical labor supply curve. It's at some point people want to trade off labor for leisure. There are other things, though, that affect supply, not just the wage, things that actually change the supply curve. So what are some of the supply shifters that we might see in the labor market? Well, one of them would be other employment opportunities. So basically, this involves what happens if in this labor market and this labor market. So maybe we have, we'll put hamburger flippers here. So working in fast food, it's a low-skilled occupation. And here's demand and here's supply. Well, what might change that supply curve is if there's a change in a similar low wage or low skilled job market. So let's say we have waiters and waitresses over here, or busboys or whatever, serving tables over on this side. And let's say that there is a change in the wage to serving tables. If the wage goes up, well, that means that there will be a shift in labor. We'll see the labor supply over here increase as people will want those higher wages, and we'll see a labor supply decrease in the preparation of food market because of the relative wage. So that's one thing that can shift the supply curve. A second thing that can shift the supply curve is the changing composition of the workforce. So as the baby boomer generation retires, that's going to cause the supply in the market to decrease for a lot of jobs. So here we have the labor supply just generally, and as baby boomers retire, they don't want to be part of the labor force anymore. That shifts the supply curve to the left. A similar thing would happen with immigration, or just simply migration from one part of a country to another. It changes the number of people in the labor force. So if we have more immigration in the country, this is one of the concerns that some people have, is that it will shift the supply curve of labor to the right and drive wages down. Of course, the same thing can happen if people move from, say, Massachusetts and New York down to Florida. That changes the supply of labor in those specific geographic areas as well. So these are things that change the supply in the labor market. And when you change the supply, you change the equilibrium wage. So let's take a look at the way the market is supposed to work as far as equilibrium is concerned. So again, here we are looking at the labor market. And it works pretty much the same way as any other market. Again, here's our demand curve, here's our supply curve. And if the wage is too low, so here we have the low wage, then we should see the same thing happen in the labor market as we would in any other market. The quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, and we call this a shortage of labor. Now, this has actually some really interesting policy applications. If wages are too low, then it might cause businesses to have to raise their wage, even if that low wage is the minimum that they have to pay. They may choose to pay more simply to get the workers that they need to eliminate the shortage. So I was picking up some fast food for my kids just the other day, and there was a sign in the pickup window that said the that they were hiring. They were starting at $9 an hour. Now, in Pennsylvania, the minimum wage is 7.25. But this restaurant wasn't able to find people, or didn't think they could find enough people at 7.25, so they're paying higher wages. They're trying to get closer to what is probably the equilibrium wage. So the markets will dictate the wages. Politicians can try, but they don't always do a very good job of that, especially of keeping up with what the market is actually saying. So at least where I live, it seems that at this time, there's a shortage of labor. The quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded, and that's probably because the wages are too low. Now, if the other circumstance occurs, so if the wage is too high, then what we see is that the quantity demanded for labor will go down and the quantity supplied will go up, and then we'll have a surplus of labor, where there are more people who want jobs than there are jobs available. And part of the problem here is that if the wages are too high, we talked about this a little bit ago, businesses will try to replace labor with capital. So higher wages will be good for the people who can get jobs, but it could create a surplus of labor, people who want to work but can't find jobs. That's why we tend to see the market, if the wages are too high, if it is possible, the market's going to put pressure downward on wages. And again, if the wage is too low, then the market will put upward pressure on wages to get to this equilibrium point. I'll just call this wage EQ, so that the market can clear. In that sense, the market is just like any other market that we've seen. Now, how does this really play out? This looks really nice and easy and convenient, but that's just on paper. What about reality? So let's see how this might play out in the market for nurses. The market for nurses looks just like any other labor market. We have demand and we have supply. Now, what we've seen is that the demand for nurses has increased as the population ages. Here is our initial equilibrium, and demand goes up. But if we leave the wage at W1, there's now a gap between supply and demand. The quantity supplied is less than the quantity demanded. So at W1, there is a shortage of nurses. And we've been hearing about the shortage of nurses now for a number of years. In order to eliminate that shortage, the wage has to go up. So the market says, all right, we need more nurses. Let's raise the wage to attract more people into nursing. But the supply curve hasn't changed because it takes time for the supply curve to change. In this case, what we might be doing is just at the margin, we might be keeping nurses from retiring by offering them more pay. We might have, there'll be a couple, some new grads who enter the market perhaps, but we're trying to reallocate labor to nursing jobs. But over time, that supply curve will shift as people go through training programs, as people move from one occupation to nursing. And so this market should change again. Let's see how that happens, or at least what should happen. So here we have the quantity and the wage once again. We have our demand, we have our supply. Here is W1. And then when demand shifted, we have W2. Now, after people go into the nursing profession, as they start through the training process, as they get to their degrees, we start to see some change in the labor supply out to S2. Now at W2, we would see a surplus of labor. At W2, after supply shifts, we would see that the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied. In order to fix that surplus, we should expect to see wages fall. And maybe wages will fall for new hires, but they're probably not going to fall for existing employees. That would drive people out of the labor market. One of the complicating factors in labor markets is that wages very seldom fall. Wages don't go down over time. Wages tend to go up over time. Now, perhaps what's going on here is there's not this perfect offsetting of demand and supply. Or perhaps it is that people don't voluntarily take pay cuts. So the model gives us an indication as to what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily tell us the complete story. We have to pay attention to what's really going on in the world. That being said, of course, there are many other things that can affect how much labor is supplied. There are some jobs that people just don't want to take, and they have to be compensated justly for it. And there are other jobs that many, many, many people would love to have, and as a result of that, there's lots of supply, and they may not get paid at all. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of labor markets is what we call compensating differentials. For example, how much would you have to be paid to do these jobs? So there's the Porta-John cleaner, and there's this guy who's basically scuba diving in trash and sewage. How much would you have to pay? How much would you have to be paid to do jobs like these horrible, dirty jobs? Or how much less would you take to work at a place like this? Compensating differentials are either increases or decreases in pay that result in part because of the job that's being performed. Compensating differentials can come as a result of a dangerous job or a very undesirable job. Typically, you have to be paid more to do very dangerous kinds of work or very disagreeable kinds of work because you have to attract people somehow to those jobs. Compensating differentials can be paid because of location or lifestyle. So you might be willing to take a little less to live in Hawaii or take a little bit less for a job, say, on St. Thomas, because the location of the job is so pleasurable and the lifestyle surrounding the job can be so valuable and enjoyable. It could be that there is a compensating differential because of the sort of the fame factor, or perhaps just this kind of the fashion aspect. And I'm going to put that in quotes because it's not necessarily fashion in terms of clothing or makeup or hair or anything like that, but just the kind of the hanger on. Maybe we want to call it that, where the job is conducted in close proximity to famous people, or it's just a very desirable job. I had a friend who graduated from college and took a job with a basketball team. At the time, it was the Seattle Supersonics. That was before they moved to Oklahoma City. And he took a job with them, and he was super excited. He'd wanted this job for a long time. We found out later that he didn't get paid at all for this job for the first year he had it. The compensating differential was basically, you get to work for us and we don't have to pay you. And if you don't like those terms, we have 1,000 people in line who will take them. Because of the desire of working with a professional sports team. This happens in a lot of media-related jobs, jobs on the radio, jobs in television, jobs in the movies, where the part of the compensation package is basically you get to be around famous people. We also see compensating differentials, though, when the job requires a high level of education or human capital. So some jobs that are very, very specialized and require very special type of education might end up paying a lot more because there's just not very many people who do that job. Of course, the flip side is that if the job itself isn't in high demand, then it doesn't matter how few people are applying for the job. I have a friend, for example, who has a PhD in 16th century epic Spanish poetry. Now, he's one of a very few people with that specialty. But as you might imagine, there's not that much demand for his job. So even though he has a great degree of education, he's very smart and very knowledgeable about this, he's kind of like the blacksmith of the education world. There's just not much demand for that job. But a lot of jobs do have these compensating differentials. So if you become a neurosurgeon or a specialist in patent law, those people, there's not that many of them, and they are in demand, so you get these considerable compensating differentials. A really good example of this idea of compensating differentials has been going on during the coronavirus pandemic. Some companies voluntarily paid their workers more than they needed to. They gave them what amounted to as hazard pay for coming in and taking risks with their health that they normally wouldn't have to take. And so companies like Target and Wegmans and Costco and even Tractor Supply were paying their workers an extra $2 an hour as a compensating differential for the health risk of coming into work during a pandemic. This is one of the reasons why people continued to come into work and maybe said, that's $600 a week that I could be making if I was unemployed. I'm not going to take that. I'm going to continue to work because now they're making it worth my while. Even though it's a little bit more dangerous, I'm willing to come into work. Now, there's one other thing I want to mention about labor markets, and that is unions. Unions are definitely part of the labor market. They're part of the understanding the labor market, and unions have done a really good job of increasing the amount of pay that people earn. That's one of the main reasons why people join a union. It increases workplace safety, they increase wages, but it also, by increasing wages, causes some people to be out of work. Unions can create this problem that we saw a little bit earlier, where if they demand wages above equilibrium, so if this is our union wage, then we create this situation where the quantity demanded is less than the quantity supplied, and we have a surplus of workers. Unions achieve their objective through what we call collective bargaining. Collective bargaining simply means that instead of everybody negotiating their own wages, the union negotiates compensation packages, and that's health care and wages for all workers. And this is great for the union because, and for the workers, is because it gives them a lot more power. If you can say you need to work with the union or you're going to lose all of your employees, it's far better for the workers than to say, well, each worker goes in and talks to the human resource manager and says, this is what I want to be paid. And if it's outrageous, you could just fire one person at a time and it's not going to affect the overall business. Collective bargaining can also be good for the employer, though, because they don't have to negotiate with every single employee. So if you're, for example, General Motors and you have tens of thousands of employees, you don't have to negotiate with each one individually. So that can be a benefit to you as well. It can save a ton of time if you're just negotiating with one bargaining unit. The thing about unions, though, is that over the last 30 or 40 years, union membership has declined pretty substantially in the United States. Part of the reason for that is that businesses understand they have to pay their workers a reasonable wage if they want to keep them. And there have been enough laws passed regarding workplace safety that unions aren't as necessary for that purpose either. So, unions are around. They're certainly around, especially in the public sector for government workers and in teaching and services like fire departments and police departments. But there are far fewer unions now than there used to be. Well, that's it for labor markets. And this is really just an overview of labor markets, but hopefully it's given you something to think about in terms of what you're about to enter into in the next few years, if not sooner, when it comes to trying to find a job. Think about the things that you can do to affect how much you get paid. Think about how productive you are, whether you can be replaced. Think about, are you adding to profits? And if you're not, how can you do that? How can you get better and be more productive and more valuable to the businesses that want to employ you? Those are important things to think about. And when you make a decision on your college major, it's important to think about whether or not this is something that businesses are looking for, and that can, if you're going to help to produce something that consumers want, because that is probably the most important thing when it comes to keeping a job, is whether or not your business is producing things consumers want. All right, so that's labor markets, and we'll be moving on into a different topic the next time we get together.